Awesome. Excellent. Everything's been so incredibly well organised so far and run so smoothly, and then I didn't have a clicker organised, and I'm the loose one. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come back and speak to you again. I feel more pressure now, I must admit, after the introduction. Hopefully, last year I got to come around and play with the Star Wars theme set of slides, and now I've been invited back to follow up on some of the topic and the issues that I've raised. So I feel as though after going from a fun and loose adventure, now I feel as though I need to deliver much more. But so thank you very much for the opportunity. One of the things I did, I must admit, I thought, being the first speaker at the conference, I thought, there is no way anyone could say before I get up here the things that I want to say. Having now just listened to the minister, I'm like, far out, I need to change some of my slides. But that's okay, because that'll just potentially allow me to go a little bit quicker in a few different parts, and we'll be able to have some questions at the end. Because I'm going to trap you in here so you can't get distracted by the race course, the blinds are all down now, so you must pay attention to me. Hopefully there's enough slides to keep you awake as we go along. I am pushing I'm sure I can't muck up this button, right? Oh no, now I feel like I've clicked about 5 clicks in the same time. Yep. Oh, it is there now. Oh, as I said, going first and all these things. My background is actually in primary education. So when I was thinking here, how am I going to best capture secondary? So what I had to do, courtesy of my mum, I went and found my year 12 graduating class there. I'm not going to leave it there for long enough for you to try to find me. I had a lot more hair when I was in year 12, let's just put it that way. But yeah, we're going to see how, I hopefully have some stories that will be able to still work across there. And for those of you who were really struggling, I'm right up near the 75 in the back row. Still a massive forehead there. I just had more hair to try to cover it up at the time. We've had a wonderful welcome to country this morning, and I too pay my respects to the Ghana people and to all the nations in which you've travelled from across the state. To give you some insight and given the importance of context as we're going forward, I've actually travelled to you from Awabakal country, and this is a lovely photo of Awabakal country. Awaba, the first part of that means flat water, which is Lake Macquarie, for those of you familiar with the area, a couple of hours north of Sydney. So Awaba refers to the flat water of Lake Macquarie, and Cal is the male suffix there to go along there. And given that we're talking about context, I'm incredibly aware that, I come from New South Wales, and after listening to, Mr. Boyer, I'm the state that's struggling with some finance. No, I'm coming from the evil empire. That's the only way to think of, New South Wales often when you're going there. But I think it's really important that we think about the context where we're coming from. And I'm acutely aware that I'm not coming from either a secondary school background or a South Australian background. But hopefully, given that you've just heard the dire straits situation New South Wales is in, I can share with you stories that you may wish to avoid extensively along there. But yes, I do acknowledge the wonderful job that the Awabakal people did taking care of the country that I'm very fortunate to live and spend a lot of my time working on now. Following up from a minister is always a tough gig. I too am going to try to cut ministers some slack. I've spent a lot of time, the housing affordability research has been really popular with, actually I'm not sure if popular is the right word. It's got a lot of attention. I've spent a lot more time with politicians and bureaucrats in the last couple of years, and if I am trying to be generous to them, which for the first 15 years of my career I definitely wouldn't have been, but maybe I'm just getting old and soft. But I do think that most politicians that we work with, and definitely the case of the minister that we were hearing this morning, is they do generally want to make the world a better place. Most of them, at least all the ones that I've been fortunate enough to meet with, all the politicians and policymakers do actually want to improve the conditions for those who are working in schools and, of course, student outcomes. The challenge, or what I believe the challenge is, that most of them don't know what they're doing, or they don't know what best to do is possibly a better way of phrasing that, and therefore they're always listening for how to make things better. Probably not surprisingly, the people who do the best job of telling them what to do tend to be consultants and those who have no background in education, and those who make their money telling people the simple solutions of how to fix things. I think that's part of the challenge. That's a challenge for policymakers, but it's also a challenge for us as educators. If I use that royal we and include myself as an educator, which I do consider myself an educator, part of our challenge is, how do we tell those stories? How do we make sure that we get those very rich stories that you heard this morning from the minister into various outlets, so we can talk about the work that we do in schools on a day-to-day basis to try to bring about equitable excellence? That's part of what I'm hopefully going to be able to talk to you about and give you some ideas on this morning. Because I didn't get to play around with Star Wars this year, I tried to play around with other sort of background things to see if I could get there. So I possibly spent way too much time on background slides at times. But thinking around, how do we actually start to build a framework for influence? Everyone's already incredibly stretched. I'm well aware of that. I'm married to a teacher. My son is now at university training to be a teacher. Incredibly aware of how stretched we are. But that's why we need some frameworks and different ways of thinking about how do we communicate and what do we need to communicate to different audiences. This slide has lots of moving parts. One of the ways to communicate, and arguably what our topic around equitable excellence, it's a big, bold vision. It's one of those big, bold visions that arguably everyone would nod along with. Very few people set out to have an inequitable system or a system that doesn't strive for excellence. So most people are going to nod along with that. But there is a place for having those bold visions, those big aspirational goals in which we aim to deliver on. There's also, as we heard this morning, really powerful human stories around what is actually taking place in our schools, what's actually, even more than schools, some of those human stories about what's taking place in communities and classrooms, and there is a place for those alongside these big, bold visions as well. There's also a place, shock horror, the person who works in uni starts arguing for rigorous social science, but there is also a place for robust research, even stuff that sometimes doesn't say what we want it to hear, but there is a place for this because different audiences want to hear that, particularly some of those who work in the background or those that we don't see. The same as there's also spots for data and statistics. Most education groups I talk to tend to hate data, tend to hate statistics and that, but it's actually, it's a really powerful tool that we have, and often speaking back to government with government's own data and stats is a useful way of doing these things as well. And of course, there's really always a place for policy impacts and actually telling, this is what this policy looks like. You heard, this morning around how New South Wales runs out of money, that type of stuff. There's plenty. New South Wales is full of stories around some of the impacts of all of these things. And I've said lots of people, the best part about being married to a teacher, I take that back. One of the bonuses of being married to a teacher is I have lots of stories about the impacts of things that go on in schools. That's definitely not the best part about being married to Amy. There are far many other benefits to that beyond just the stories. Although, as I think I was saying to Jason, I hope she never leaves her school because it provides me with so many stories for my classes. Thinking about this, if these are the different types of stories we can tell, the different types of data evidence, they all work with slightly different audiences. And sometimes we get those audiences wrong. This is not a framework I came up with. This framework was courtesy of Oxfam, actually, and how they bring about influence. So if we think about politicians, what are the types of things that influence politicians? And this is one of those moments after listening to the minister, I thought, oh gosh, maybe I need to change where these arrows go now. But maybe not. Politicians do love to have big, bold visions. That's what they take to elections. That's what they take to win influence over groups in their campaign. They love those bold visions, but they also love those human stories. You had a classic example up here, and this is not being critical anyway, but you had a classic example of bold visions of achieving equity and excellence across a school system matched with very real human stories of this is what it looks like in a classroom. Politicians love that type of stuff. When we're talking with politicians, they're arguably the most effective ways of trying to have some influence with them. What are these big, bold visions we're trying to achieve? And what's a really concrete story, or multiple concrete stories of, well, this is what it looks like. This is why you've got, some little chap jumping on your lap and climbing all over you. This is the reality of what's going on. This is what we're trying to work against or work to overcome. Civil servants, of course, are slightly different. The policy advisors, the people who work in the back end of bureaucracy, the people you meet in rooms that don't have windows often. These folks tend to like, rigorous, robust studies that show the effect of things or what they need to do. We often critique things like randomised controlled trials, and I've done a whole bunch of sessions with Jenny Gore recently where she's been talking these up, but they're the policymakers in that background, those civil servants in the background want to know things work. If there's investment going into somewhere, they want to know that it's going to work. They want to have some confidence that it's going to work going forward because they're going to be investing money in it. And you know, whether that's right or wrong, you know, there's public taxpayer money going into these initiatives. You want to have a bit of a safe bet that what you're going to do is had some things. And of course, one of the things I've learnt from politicians is that Treasury runs things far more than often ministers do. So it's just making work what Treasury does. So having the sort of data and stats to go back there and the rigorous, robust research that does that work. Of course, systemic folks bring a slightly different lens to this one as well. But at the same breath, they want to take on evidence-based processes at work. They also want to know what the impacts are. It's less just about the safe bet, it's about the impacts. You want Martin to know that things that he's going to pursue are going to have an impact. Unless Martin just tells you what he's going to pursue and then it's your job to make the impact happen. And of course, there's communities as well. Communities want to hear this. Taxpayer, you know, we heard the Minister talk about this morning, you know, the public appetite for some of this stuff. They want to know things work. They want to have human stories. Communities want to know these things are going to work for their community, not just for Adelaide. I work in New South Wales. Often when you speak to schools groups outside of the metropolitan area, that I often get reminded that New South Wales doesn't stand for New South Wales at all. It's really just Newcastle, Sydney, Wollongong, and anyone outside of there doesn't matter. So for many communities, when they hear policies being announced or initiatives being announced, for them it's like, well, does that matter to anyone outside of, you know, Newcastle, Sydney, Wollongong? Communities want to know, how's it going to work actually for our community? And that poses one of the great challenges for equitable excellence. It's what actually brings context to the fore. What is the impact of this for our community? What does it look like in our school? What does it look like in our classrooms? What does it look like for our students? That's a really important message that we often lose. For, of course, changing public beliefs, if part of our goal in bringing about equitable excellence and recognising the role of context, it's to get the public to come along with that and change the discourse around education. It's pretty easy in education, at least in Australia at the moment, to just blame teachers. I'm pretty sure NAPLAN results last week were all teachers' fault. Like for someone who works in a uni, it was good to sort of get half a day off where it wasn't uni's fault. But, you know, then ultimately if it's teachers' fault, it's our fault because we're doing such a terrible job. Very few storylines around NAPLAN last week looked at the stratification of our education systems, the actual systems and processes that we have in place. Changing these public opinion, you need these bold visions, you need to understand some of the impact. It's the stories we get to tell of what it looks like. And of course, the media, part of changing that public discourse is getting the media on side. I must admit, I haven't had enough, I didn't invest enough time in looking at South Australian media around these. But media do love human stories. They also love stats. They loved being able to put a percentage of students who aren't meeting the bare minimum standards in there, overlooking, even if 2/3 are, even overlooking the vast majority of students who are achieving stronger. And this is just a framework. As I said, I borrowed it from Oxfam in relation to how they've delivered influence on an international scale over time. But I think there is value in actually starting to think of what types of stories are we telling about our schools? What scale of stories? When do you need to tell the story of the individual student or the individual teacher? When do you need to tell the story about your school, your community? And when's the time to come together as a collective and tell the story about South Australian secondary schools? Or dare I say all, you know, secondary schools across the country. And knowing who is it that you're talking to? What are you trying to do? Sharing stories with purpose is arguably the underlying argument that I'm trying to make here is, you know, that you're sharing the right types of stories with the right types of audience to tell the story around equitable excellence, to tell the story of how context matters, so that we don't just get someone in Canberra or in Adelaide making a universal decision and assuming that it works for everyone. So 4 big questions to try to keep me on my toes and keep me on time, more or less, today is starting to actually think around, what does equity mean? It's one of those words that we often just we use. We're all pretty comfortable with it. No one's probably, jumped on their computer or phone and started Googling, what is he talking about with equity? We're all quite comfortable with the term, but what does it actually mean? And more than just what does it mean, what does it actually start to mean for policy and what we're actually doing in our schools and across our collective? And then once we have a bit of or at least you hear the Scott version of what equity means, once you've done that, what does that actually start to mean for your school? Like, do you actually know how equitable your school is at the moment? Not just the vibe in the castle style, but actually, how do you know? If the minister comes to visit you, which hopefully he'll get around to visiting all of you if he comes to visit you, or any politician comes to visit you, what is the story that you tell and what is the data and evidence that you use to back that up? How do you actually know that your school is equitable? And then, of course, what do you need to know? What do you wish you knew about your school now that you don't? And of course, what do you need to do about that? Or maybe not do, or maybe stop doing as well, which is something we'll return to along the way. And then, of course, one of the challenges, many challenges to do with context, but one of the greatest challenges to do with context is how do you recognise context in your own individual school or your own classrooms, your own, however you much to break it down. But what does that actually mean across a system? How do we get this balance between recognising context, the uniqueness of context, another idea that we're all quite comfortable with, but actually do something at scale? How does anyone, whether it's the minister, whether it's Martin, whether it's your association, how do you actually deliver systemic wide change, yet also recognise the value of context? It's arguably one of those challenges where I just throw it out there and then jump on a plane and go back home. But it's one of those things to think through and one of those enduring challenges for you to go along the way. They're the 4 questions, it's sort of 4.5, that I'm going to try to make sure that I deliver on in the next sort of bit of time. I'm pretty loose on the time. For those people who ever take classes with me, I'm a terrible timekeeper. So I don't even know why I look at it half the time. I just go off on random stories. If we start to think around what does equity mean, and we often conflate equity with equality, and we start to shift that. So if we start to think around what is it we're actually talking about with equity, and one of the things that I challenge you to think about is we often talk a lot about equality, which is very, very much an input variable, the access and all of that. Equity is actually a much harder thing. There's a reason we probably haven't achieved equity. There's one huge question of political will. Equity for me is an outcome variable. And that means you actually have to be held accountable for outcomes, not just creating opportunities for everyone to have access. That's a major challenge. It's very difficult to start making claims around equity and then have an election in 3 years' time. Do you want to be held accountable in the lead up to an election for not delivering on equity? It's part of the reason why I believe we don't have a lot of equity stuff. But this comes down from a large scale, from large international commitments. Sustainable Development Goal 4 is about equity and inclusion. On a global scale, we have education systems committed to delivering equity and inclusion. Now, of course, when you look at the many indicators of Sustainable Development Goal 4, Australia actually stacks up okay. We have school systems. There's a lot of parts of sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia that don't have access in the same way, and Sustainable Development Goal outlines enough for them. But we are committed to these ideas of equity and inclusion. Of course, when it translates into Australian education commitments, we shift from equity and inclusion to equity and excellence. As you know, and this is the closest I think I come to doubling up on a slide loosely from last year, that language actually starts to matter, talking about equity and excellence, hence why I've been pushing for equitable excellence. We shouldn't think of these two things separately. We shouldn't need to pursue some policy agenda to achieve equity, some policy positions to achieve excellence. We should be achieving equitable excellence along the way. So language does actually start to matter. And of course, as you heard the Minister talk about, we do have needs-based funding as a way of getting towards this equity. We do a really good job in needs-based funding of moving towards equality and trying to make sure these things. We possibly don't have the built-in accountabilities around the equitable outcomes, but they do exist. Where does this start to lead us to? So if you start to think around how governments think about these types of things, for those of you who enjoy playing around on Productivity Commission websites, so I'm going to guess I'm probably the only one in the room who ever does that. This is the actual measurement framework that the Productivity Commission uses for school education. It looks at equity, not surprising at all. Of course, it associates equity entirely with access. And you can see the outputs there is attendance and participation by selected equity groups. That's the measure for equity as judged by ROGs. You have a whole bunch of stuff around effectiveness, as you can see there in the measures. And of course, not surprising, given it's the Productivity Commission, you have efficiency built in there. So you have those 3 E's, equity, effectiveness, and efficiency. The reason I throw that up there is hopefully not so you get, your blood boiling about Productivity Commission and all of those types of things, but start to think around, this is how government and Treasury think about education. This is how they think about things like equity. And as you can see, effectiveness is given far more attention. And two, what I think are really interesting changes, because I'm assuming you haven't been looking at ROGs every year for the last decade, the inclusion of the 2 boxes that are not coloured in the outputs, quality teaching and workforce sustainability, are new additions with measures to come. So this, when you think about policies that are coming down the track and how equity, excellence, all of these things are playing out in the future, the idea that quality and quality teaching potentially has a measure to come. Maybe it makes you feel really comfortable. Maybe it makes you start to think about how really important it is that we start to tell stories to government about what is the quality of the work that we do in schools. Not that I don't trust government to come up with a good measure of quality teaching, but, it's good to have in mind. It's also a good laying down the context of what's the environment that we're working in when governments think about these things. Of course, you've got the Australian Education Act, for those of you who love to look at legislation. I think this highlights a couple of really interesting points, again, to tell us around things that sit behind. This is just straight from the preamble. You can read the whole 140-odd pages, but the preamble does a lot of the heavy lifting for us. If we think about the outcomes that are mentioned in the preamble to the Australian Education Act. So again, this is setting that context around how government thinks of equity and excellence. The goal is that our schools prepare students for employment, which is often given privilege and primacy because it's mentioned first, and civic life. So in the preamble to the Australian Education Act, there is more than just becoming an employable and a functioning member of society, the economic society. There's also civic life. There's more than just being employed. So I think that's an important thing for us to keep in mind. There's a whole bunch of stuff around 21st century learning. There is an expectation that schools continuously improve. And I'm sure you feel that all the time, the pressure to be constantly improving. There's an interesting sort of perpetual improvement cycle built in, can you keep improving forevermore? When do you ever reach a threshold? Maybe you just keep pushing staff forevermore to get more efficient. No, I'm going in a positive space today. And of course, to me, this is the most important line in the Australian Education Act. One, because I just possibly take it out of context, but I just use it all the time. But I think it's incredibly important that the federal government works with educational authorities. I think, that's part of the governance structure, but to provide every child with a quality education, regardless of where they live and what school they attend. Why do I think that's the most important line? Because I think that's a line from government that we can use to talk back to government. In the preamble to the Australian Education Act, we have this explicit statement that we provide a quality education to every child, no matter where they live. So we're bringing in geography there, and no matter what school they attend. There shouldn't be any ghettos of public schools or stratification. We should have quality schools across the board. If you look at the Education and Children's Services Act in South Australia, trying to bring this down to the context of where you go, I didn't highlight any passages in here, but I will draw your attention to the work on the left that outlines the exact same type of language, right? Ensuring that education provided to children and students in this state is of a high quality, development of accessible range of education and children's services that meet the needs of all groups in our community. So we want the highest quality education that meets the need. And an important thing, on the right-hand side are a bunch of principles, as in LES, principles that need to be taken into account. And you see there the best interest of the child. Every child has a right. Recognitions around there. No discrimination. Involvement of people. So we look at this context setting that we have from a governance standpoint. But then how do we start to know, right? I try to change the background colours, keep you awake, so you don't switch off on me. Even though I'm up first, don't switch off on me. How do you actually start to know? Now, this is one of those really tricky situations. This actually speaks to me about the importance of context and the importance of narrative. I don't work in South Australia, and I must admit I'd only ever been to South Australia about once up until about 2020, but this is about my 4th or 5th visit in the last 18 months. So I feel as though I'm becoming a little bit more regular, but I'm absolutely an outsider. I wanted to take the opportunity to think around how does South Australia look from the outside just on publicly available data, just the sort of stuff I could access from my computer. It's quite possible I'm not telling the story that you experience. If that's the case, pedagogically, for me, that's probably a good thing because it highlights the disparity between what it may look like on the outside and what you experience on the daily. And if I nail it, well, then that tells another interesting story pedagogically. But let's have a look. So in trying to understand a little bit about context, I was going to lead with this, but I thought, no, I'll wait for a little bit later on. This is Valtteri Bottas, for those of you who don't know. He's a Formula One driver. His partner, Trisha Cromwell, comes from Adelaide. He was getting interviewed on a Formula One, one of the episodes in the lead up to one of the races earlier this year by Ted Kravitz, and he had this question around him, and he said, your partner's from Adelaide. What is that city known for? How is that city known? And without even having too much of a rest, he goes, Radelaide. And I thought, that's a great answer. Of course, according to Ted Kravitz, he was wrong because he was meant to say the city of churches. But he said people know it as Radelaide. That has nothing to do with my presentation, but I thought I've got to get that in there somewhere because I feel as though it's one of the. It actually highlights something about context, and or I'm drawing an incredibly long bow just to try to make sure I have this slide in there. But from the standpoint of Ted Kravitz, it was the wrong answer. It wasn't what was written on the card, sort of thing. But for someone who had familiarity with Adelaide or Radelaide, that's how it was. That was how it was more affectionately known. And Ted just basically telling him it was wrong highlights this really interesting thing around context, around knowing a place because you know it, and knowing a place because you looked at it on Wikipedia or somewhere like that, or some official website. So that's just a totally random Valtteri Bottas story in the middle of a presentation around context. Thinking around what it looks like on the outside, it's always difficult to look at it's very difficult to look at the geographic spread of another state or territory when you live elsewhere. So I like to make lots of maps. So on the left-hand side, you've got a map there, and this is just grabbed straight from ACARA data, and I just pumped it into QGIS. You don't need to know. So I pumped it in there, and just wanted to look at where secondary schools were. One of the things that struck me really quickly about South Australia was the number of combined schools that you have, which is arguably not shared across all states and territories, in a public school context, right? And therefore I kept that. Well, first I wasn't too happy with the map, but then I thought, no, it actually tells a really interesting story around the number of combined schools that you have and the geographic spread that you have of schools in South Australia. Hopefully you're not looking at that map thinking, oh my gosh, he's left off my school. I just grabbed the ACARA data, popped it in and said keep government schools, secondary and combined. And you can see the geographic spread there because it may not necessarily be known for those who are not in South Australia how tight your major cities in a regional, outer regional, and then how quickly it becomes not just remote but very remote. When you sit there, and I can put hand on heart and say this, when I sit in Newcastle, I possibly, prior to this map, did not have that grasp of South Australia. It's one of those things around context that you don't necessarily know when you come from outside that. It's one of the things about telling that incredibly important story around what it's like to be in these schools. The other stuff, again, is just jump straight from ACARA, like the number of teachers, the number of staff, understanding the scale. operations. And because I became fascinated by the whole combined thing, that's what the figure down the bottom right there, because I thought, oh wow, I wonder how often my New South Wales gaze shapes how I see these things. So that's looking at the percentage of combined schools that you have by state and territory. And as you can see, South Australia is well up there. And you can see why, possibly, as a New South Welsh person, being that really low total on the left-hand side, maybe, that's a lens that I've brought there. So I'm trying to admit up front, I don't understand your context. That creates a wonderful opportunity, not just to talk to me, although, feel free to take that advantage too, but to talk to others around. People don't necessarily understand your context. You can become so comfortable in your own context, you don't realise that not everyone else understands it. Telling these stories are incredibly important. I was also trying to look at the share of non-government schools, changes over time, over an extended period of time. So this looks, it comes out of a paper that I wrote, that was looking at post-John Howard sort of era. And I know it looks really ugly, or at least it does it's not 100% clear, but if you look on the left, so that's based on the changes in the number of schools, if you just look at proportions. So, South Australia is up there with an increase in the number of schools, non-government schools over that period since 1996. A lot of it, in some ways, you have, and you would know this far better than me, you seem to close a whole bunch of schools there in one period. A lot of small schools you closed and merged, and that played into that. On the right-hand side, that's actually about enrolment, the enrolment of students in government and non-government schools. And you can actually start to see, there's a reason you're the largest, right? The largest uptick in non-government school enrolments over that period of time. That was trying to share a story as a New South Welsh person. Of course, on an overall scale, but you're looking at a bit of an uptick, you're looking at a bit of a trend. How do we make sure that we understand the context, tell the work that we're doing along there? I just include myself in a royal we there too, not quite sure. Trying to nat that down a little bit more around still looking at just the ratio of enrolments in public secondary schools compared to non-government secondary schools. You're still above the national mean, the national average there. As you can see, New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT are those ones that have much higher. But at the same time, you're getting towards there. That's not to be a doom and gloom. That's not a doom and gloom thing, but it's just to try to set these contexts of where you sit around there. And, I feel like I was a little bit trumped on these ones by the minister this morning, but in playing with the ROGS data, there is a whole bunch of data that sits behind the ROGS data sets, and you can download and play with Excel spreadsheets till your heart is content. I picked out just a couple of key ones here. So in this case here is the proportion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students that are in government schools and non-government schools. And as you can see, the heavy lifting, I suppose it feels quite wrong. It actually feels wrong saying that about any equity group. But you can see that this particular equity group that's identified in most policies and procedures that we have going across all states and territories, the vast majority of them are enrolled in government schools. Government schools are the ones most likely to be teaching this. You do get a slight little uptick there in the non-government sector, but the vast majority are in government schools. Similarly, although arguably more extreme, is the percentage of students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. You can see there's a considerable gap there, once again, with the government sector doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And these are government statistics, right? So as we're taught, using government statistics to talk back to the government. I took out the other one, which was about students with disabilities, because you couldn't narrow it down to individual states like you could in there. And once again, government schools were doing the heavy lifting in the disability, enrolling students with disability. There was a weird uptake in the non-government sector. I have no data or evidence to support backing it up. If I was having a hunch and just doing an opinion piece on a Thursday morning, I'd probably say that they're getting better at playing the game of securing funding by ticking boxes, but I have nothing to back that up. It is pure speculation. Along there, as the minister suggested this morning, Funding is a default that we often go to on this. This is just showing using using consistent dollars across, so you can compare across time. You can see how funding has gone up. I can fly through these slides because the minister already touched on a whole bunch of these things. The immediately defaulting, though, the story to take from this, the immediately defaulting to more funding doesn't necessarily land, of course, when politicians say, but we've given you more funding. That's why I think it's incredibly valuable to use all the other government data that we have to show disproportionate level of enrolments, the targets of equity interventions are more likely to be in government schools. That type of argument. As I said, can fly through these. This is just from an outsider standpoint. If you, instead of trying to compare schools, which I think is wrong, if you just aggregate NAPLAN data to an SA2 level, which is statistical area 2, which is sort of 30,000-ish people who are meant to interact. So this is a collation, and it's a collation of all the schools. This is just looking at Year 9 reading, and you get a picture of what South Australia looks like. There is no great value in, don't stress over this slide. Definitely do not attack me over this slide. It was just another thing to go with the funding, that we need a more nuanced argument than just give us more funding. Other things that we know, I feel like I'm doing you death by PowerPoint of data now. These are just things we know, right? The higher your parents' education, the more likely you are to do well. How do we actually start to factor these things in? Even I'm starting to see there's a countless amount of data that we can use to talk back. And of course, NAPLAN, NAPLAN came out really recently. The interesting challenge that you have here, and the way in which we can start to speak back, is you can see from this NAPLAN data that the further you are away from a major city, the lower the levels of performance in NAPLAN. So what does that mean? We've got something to do with geography inequity that we need to deal with. And then, of course, how do we actually take that context into account, not just impose an Adelaide version on every school across and that's not to pick on Adelaide, but how do we make sure we don't just impose an Adelaide version on every school across the state? How do we actually factor in that geography and what that geography is and isn't doing? And of course, there's other things there around Indigenous students as well. They're all things you know. They're all things the government already knows. There's no reason for them not to be able to act on this type of stuff. So what do we need to know? What do we need to do? And I struggled here to try to make sure I didn't do everything I was going to do in my workshop this morning, because then no one would need to come to my workshop. But here are some things that I think, and this is entirely a Scott version of things, so feel free to argue with this as much as you want. I'm of the opinion that if you can't put evidence behind something, you probably shouldn't claim it. I do this often with my classes, and some of your independent school colleagues always struggle with this one. I say, you can't really say you're producing tomorrow's leaders. What does that look like? What is the actual evidence you've got that you do that? And they often struggle with this thing. I think a really powerful message we potentially have as public school educators is to back up what we claim. If you want to say that you develop the whole child, you arguably have that narrative. Back it up. Tell us what it looks like. Tell us how you know that. The idea that if you're going to pursue this path, that you can come up with a measure for it. Doesn't mean you don't have a crappy measure for it, but you can arguably measure it. But at the same time, and this one probably should have been in red as well, there are unintended consequences for going down this pathway. One of the strongest unintended consequences I can think of that most teachers seem to relate to very quickly is when you remove, at least this, I'll just say this is a New South Wales story, but arguably it's shared across the country. When you removed the inspectorate, so when you remove someone coming to actually observe you teach and check your program and do all of that type of stuff, those outside schools got a little bit worried around how do you guarantee the quality of teaching and learning in all schools if you no longer have someone coming out and looking at the quality of teaching in all those schools. The simplest way, if you're trying to do that really efficiently and you're sitting in a government office, that's arguably the genesis of standardised testing that becomes a proxy for quality teaching or the quality of teaching. It may be considered a longbow by some of you, but they're the sort of unintended consequences that sometimes happen if you remove something. If Politicians, governments get worried about things, they fill it with something else. Of course, the way to overcome that is just fill them with so much data that it just collapses, right, and breaks down the whole system and they have to start all over again. The message, that's me getting distracted already. The message that I want to try to tell you here is it's lovely to potentially say you want to develop the whole child and do all of these things and have all of these non-academic outcomes that you. But then you get tasked with the challenge of, well, how do you know? What's the data and evidence that comes up with that? And therefore you have to ask yourself the question, how much of children or youth's lives are you willing to subject to measurement? I don't have a definitive answer for that, but it is a question to start to think about. If you want to expand how much schools are doing, you potentially expand how many things get measured, and someone wants to count and someone wants to do these things. And that's a challenge. How much in your context do you want to have the children and youth that are in your school on a day-to-day basis subjected to some form of their life being measured? That said, you have lots of interesting non-academic outcomes at the moment that are starting to be added to the list, or a combination of academic and non-academic outcomes. In seeking to locate this around, you've got things like wellbeing, the equity and excellence, the learner agency and effective learners. You have this agenda at the moment. You have a unique opportunity at the moment here in South Australia to actually do interesting work. How is it that you're actually going to evidence and make the claim and tell the story, tell the narrative of the work of not just secondary schools, but all schools in South Australia, that you're delivering on the well-being of students? What is the data and evidence you want to know as school leaders about the well-being of students in your school? What's the data and evidence you want around learner agency? How are you actually giving learners agency in your schools? How are you making sure they're effective learners? What would you know? What do you want to know about that so you can plan along the way? As I said, you have this unique opportunity here in South Australia. We're not talking, I can honestly say, we're not talking about this in New South Wales. We're all explicit teaching at the moment, because explicit teaching and science of reading is going to solve all of our education problems. That and getting rid of all the crazy leftist academics in there who aren't teaching the right stuff in universities. That's going to solve our education crisis. You're in a different space, right? You're actually in this opportunity where you're looking at what are the ways of actually developing the profile of our learners. You're entrusted with a unique opportunity. Hopefully we'll get to talk about this in history in many years to come, about these unique moments that South Australia is undertaking at the moment. And you get to be the trailblazers for the rest of, that's terrible, that's startup type language. But hopefully you do the work that others are going to be able to learn from. And other states will be able to do some of this work without defaulting to explicit teaching will solve us all, cognitive load, all of that type of stuff, which is fantastic scholarship by people who work in the same university as me, but still. You have this opportunity to do this work, but it's an opportunity that needs to be taken as well, because otherwise you could end up with really poor quality proxies for these things that just become another numbers game that you end up playing along the way. And you have to ask yourself, is that a game that you want to go down? How do you actually want to tell a story? How do you want to craft a narrative, not just of the individual learners, but actually the learners in your school and the learners across your system? What is the narrative? What is it that you would want plastered all over the front page of the newspapers or running in the nightly news? Like, what is that narrative you want from your South Australian public schools that are going forward? What is the story you want to tell about this stuff along the way? Of course, if we start to think about this, and I start to think around what does this actually start to look like in your school? How can you start to go about this as a staff even, let alone as a system or anything like that? This is from some work by James Ladwig. It's couched in not the best language because I tried to honour exactly how he wrote it. But if you start to think about this thing in relation to your measures, if you think about your wellbeing, your effective learners, your learner agencies, what does that actually look like? So if you start to think about this, what does it actually look like? What does it look like from your staff's perspective as well, not just yours, but if you sat down with your staff and you said, well, what does learner agency actually look like? What does an effective learner actually look like? What does well-being for a child or a youth in my school look like? And you have that conversation and you tease out, what does it look like? You can skip that second dot point in many ways because you've been able to articulate what it looks like. If that's what you want to deliver at the end, the effective learner, the learner with agency, well-being, you want that equity and excellence, you know what that looks like at the end. We're all educators, we all know how to backward map. So if that's the outcome that we're working towards, what do our teaching and learning programs need to look like to get there? How do we need to set up our classrooms? How do we need to set up the things we go about on a day-to-day basis to make sure that's what we're delivering on? That becomes the challenge there. That enables you to actually inform what are those measures going to look like? What does it actually look like? How do we develop teaching and learning programs to get there? How do we make sure that our schools are run in ways that deliver that? If you want learner agency, which I'm not against at all, right? If you want learner agency and you want effective learners, what if you actually start to scale that up a level and you think about the same thing for your staff and your teachers, and you want staff agency, teacher agency, depends on where you want to include your professional staff. If you want staff to have agency, if you want them to be effective learners, how do you actually need to restructure your meetings at your school to make sure that you have effective learners on staff, to make sure that they have agency in it? I usually use stories about my wife's school now about how they do a terrible job with meetings and how they have countless meetings and they can have Monday and Tuesday off for staff development days, but then they'll still have a staff meeting on the Wednesday. They're back at school. My wife's back at school tonight for 6:30 for a meeting, but they still had to have a stage meeting this morning to get them there half an hour early. Is that creating agency for your staff? Is that creating effective? Think about how all of these types of things go on there. Are you doing recruitment in ways that go there? Are decisions made in your schools in ways that support this? How do you actually bring about organisational coherence? So that if you're about agency, well-being, effectiveness, equity, how do you make sure that you treat your staff and your students in these ways? And then, of course, once you do that, then you can start to speak back to the system around, well, how can they expect learner agency if they don't give school leaders agency? Why do they do things that get in the way of your effectiveness? Why do they do things that get in the way of you delivering both equity and excellence? And then why do they do a whole bunch of things that impact on your well-being? You actually get to use the language of the system back to the system. Just like you're able to use government data to speak back to government, you can use government principles to go back to them. Arguably, all this leads to some sort of theory of change. This is, again, one of those really sort of messy things. But if you think about those assumptions that go into there, that you need to have something that you're working towards. You need to have clarity about what you're working towards. Eventually, you develop some coherence. So what does this start to look like? What does this start to look like when you go forward? Is you end up with clarity. In the absence of clarity, someone else will do it for you. If you don't know what equitable excellence looks like in your context, someone will tell that story for you. Someone will look at NAPLAN data or some geographic spread and tell the story of your school for you. You need to have some clarity around what it is you're doing. You need to know what well-being looks like for the youth in your community. What does a well-adjusted, I was saying like I was psyching them to death. What does a well-adjusted, functioning youth in your community look like? It doesn't necessarily need to look the same as someone in another school. But if you don't know that, someone else is going to do it for you. What does an effective learner look like in your community? You need to have clarity around these types of things. If you don't have clarity, well, how can you expect anyone else to have clarity for it? Of course, having clarity doesn't mean that you're all doing the same thing either. That was one, when I reflect back on my own time as a school leader, the biggest, the most substantial thing I had to learn was being okay with the grey, and that it's okay that not everyone does the same thing. But that only works if there's an overarching principle that you're all working towards. The, million flowers bloom or, choose your own adventure type approach doesn't necessarily work. If you have the overarching principles, though, of equitable excellence, you're working towards well-being, effective learners, all of that type of, you have the principles there, then you can start to be okay with it because you give the opportunity for your staff to have a voice and to have agency to tell you about how they're delivering on that in their context. Doesn't mean they're not accountable because they still need to deliver on something, but they can go about it in a different way. I think as a young school leader, it took me a while to be okay with that. Of course, I was in my stage. I taught on the infants. There was a whole bunch of people who taught for longer than I'd been alive, so they were quite comfortable putting me in my place, so I had to learn it very quickly as well. But the idea that it can look different in every classroom, but you can still be working towards the same thing. And that's a major challenge for us. But it's a challenge around coherence so that you know what you're working towards. You know those outcomes that you're looking for the children and youth in your school. And that's what becomes important. You want them all to get there. The path may look a little bit different, and we're usually quite okay with that. We usually accept the idea that every context matters, every child's different, every teacher's different. The path we take to get there might be okay, might be different, but that's okay as long as we're still working on that path. Well, we want to make sure, if we think back to that preamble of the Australian Education Act, doesn't matter what school you go to, doesn't matter about your personal circumstances, you should still have access to a high quality education. That's delivered through coherence. And of course, once you've got that coherence, so you've got the clarity, you know what you're talking about, you know what you're working towards, your staff know what you're working towards, you've got coherence, so that activities that you do in your school support that purpose. If you're doing things that don't support your purpose, you actually have a reason to stop doing them because they're not supporting your purpose. That way you get to tell the narrative about the exciting work that you're doing in your schools, the ways in which you are bringing about equitable excellence. And even if you aren't equitable and excellent at the moment, you are that continuously improving school because you're aware of it and you know what needs to be done. That's when you get to have that really powerful conversation around what would you do with that extra $190 million? You'd be addressing these types of targeted issues with these human stories that are going on in your school, and you would be able to scale that across a system. That's a very nuanced argument that isn't just about give me more money and we'll get better. It's about give me more money so that we can target this particular group, whatever that group is or whatever that program is, to deliver better outcomes against these agreed upon principles, in these times. Like, you actually have a really nuanced argument that goes to that, not just a give me more money. We all want more money, but you get to have a nuanced argument about delivering equitable excellence in your context. So if we start to think about how this scales up, so you get those really narrow ones, this is how you start to say that you need the $190 million. So four big questions, and then there's three. I have no excuse for that. And I do have my glasses on as well. Three big questions for policymakers that I've learnt across the last few years as being particularly important for them. One, if you claim you're doing something, do you actually get those outcomes? So you're not just spruiking something and going, we're going to do this, and it'll be down the track. If you do something, do you actually get the outcomes you desire? So if you say you're going to do this holistic work, do you actually get holistic outcomes? Do people actually buy into that? And when we talk about stakeholders, do your teachers buy into it? Do your community buy into it? Do your students buy into it? I would say from the outside, it looks like in a South Australian context, people are buying into this sort of thing. And then the challenge, of course, becomes, so if you're sitting and trying to make decisions at a large scale, could I do this across the state? It's wonderful that you can do it in your classroom. It's wonderful you can do it in your faculty. Wonderful you can do it in your school. Is it something that I could roll out? I don't know why I just gave myself political power there. Is it something you could roll out across the state? And that becomes part of the challenge. If it's not something that can get rolled out across the state, is it limited to a good story for your school? Maybe. Is there anything wrong with that? Not necessarily. But if you want to start to get large-scale reform happening, how does it actually start to roll out across the state? So if you think around these systemic goals, if you think around what system authorities are trying to do, what politicians are trying to do, they want to arguably eliminate variance. You don't want variable quality across your system. You don't want inefficiencies. It feels funny sort of saying, systems don't want inefficiencies when they're literally full of inefficiencies, at least in New South Wales, possibly not in South Australia. But that's arguably what systems want to do, right? They want to get rid of variance. So it shouldn't matter where your child goes to school. They should get access to a high quality education wherever they go to school. It's in the preamble of the Australian Education Act, but from a system perspective, it shouldn't matter what school they go to. They should get access to it. I think so. We arguably don't want that variance. Doesn't mean every school looks the same. Doesn't mean they end up in the same spot. Doesn't mean they start in the same spot. But they should get access to the same quality of education while they're there. And though I'd hate to say it, that's how the whole Hattie 1 year's growth for 1 year's learning took off, right? That sort of idea. I'm not subscribing to that, but that's that sort of logic there. And they want to get rid of inefficiency. If you're doing things that aren't working, you stop doing them. Seems like a really simple thing to do. Of course, they don't let you do that often, but you should be able to do that. So challenge here for thinking about context. What is it that's actually like general, universal? What is it that all schools should be doing to do this? And what is it that's actually context specific? I remember teaching on Lord Howe Island. I'm not going to tell, I know I told you that story last year, but I know there are things that happen on Lord Howe Island that you could not do in any other school, just because of the nature of context specific. Usually it was like children didn't wear shoes and kindergartens had to be in the cabin with me. Year ones could be on the tray of the ute when we drove on excursions. You couldn't do that in any other school. It was context specific, right? Took me a long time to come to grips with it, but context specific. You would arguably have many examples that would do the exact same thing. When it was high tide, you start with the secondaries for the swimming carnival, so they didn't have to swim, swim further now. Those sorts of things, they're context specific. I say them lightheartedly, but there's arguably context specific things in your locations as well. At the same time, and this is an interesting tension for across systems, how do you make sure that everyone's known and valued? So at a system level, if you're trying to make a systemic level decision, how do I make sure that each one of you, your schools, are known and valued? At the same time, how do I make sure that there's quality across the whole system at scale? These are challenges if we're trying to be nice and generous to our systemic folks. How do I bring this all together and to try to make sure that there's plenty of stimulus for you to ask me questions for either now or later in the day? If we think back to some of these large-scale commitments, right, we want to make sure that every child has a quality education regardless of where they live, regardless of what school they attend. And that arguably there should be an investment, given that we were talking about funding this morning and stuff like that, an investment that's fair and transparently distributed and allocated according to need. That is government language. You have the opportunity to speak back to government to make sure that you can deliver equitable excellence in your context. You can use government language back to government. I've shown you a whole bunch of government data that you can also use to speak back to government in that case. And you arguably are awash with school level data and human stories that can support that. You have an opportunity to speak back to government using government's data and the human stories that you can do that. And you already have these sort of impact areas, not sort of, you have areas of impact already identified around wellbeing, equity and excellence. Of course, I'd like to merge those two together. Effective learners and learner agency. So you have the framework to speak back. You arguably have the data to be able to do this. What you have at the moment is a wonderful opportunity to do this. This was the wake you up slide towards the end, hence the white background and the crazy use of colours. If I was trying to put all of that starting to come together, you've got continuously improving schools and systems. We don't let systems get away with this, right? The system has to be continuously improving, not just getting at you in schools. You need to have the best prepared educators. You need them to be both prepared and supported. So you want to make sure that they've got what they need. You want your educators to have what they need. Sometimes that includes, I include data up the top there because one, because I don't mind data, but two, because most of the schools I've had to work with in the last couple of years have way more data than what they need, and a whole bunch of that data is crap. And when I say it's crap, it's like it doesn't actually help you in your teaching and learning. You often spend time, maybe not in your South Australian schools, maybe it's another one of those New South Wales stories I'm telling you. You end up with your staff generating a whole bunch of data to make someone usually in the office feel really important and get to make charts, kind of like what I did earlier. But if it's not helping you, if it's not helping your teachers to deliver better teaching and learning programs, what are you collecting the data for? If you're not giving the teachers the data that they need, you need to give them that data that they need. If it's data that they don't need, it's just to make someone else feel really important, my challenge then would be, what happens if you don't do it? And it's usually country schools are the best schools that I've come across for doing that, when they, tell me stories like, I just hung up on the director because I was teaching. They didn't ring back because they got the answer themselves anyway. They already had the data. They just tried to take a shortcut. Country principals are phenomenal for stories like that. I remember as a much younger person thinking, oh my gosh, you hung up on the director. Like, can you do that? And she was like, well, I did. I was like, wow. And of course, we need to make sure we never let systems get out of it. Like, systems engagement with you should be about making you better, should be about setting up the systems and structures that make you better so that you're delivering the highest quality teaching and learning. If one of your members of staff come to you and say, we're doing all of this stuff that is impacting on the quality of teaching and learning that I can do, maybe there's things that you can get out of their way and be a filter for them. Maybe. Hopefully, it gives you permission. Now, last year I got to play around with a whole bunch of Star Wars sort of slides, and I thought, how can I try to make sure that there's at least some Star Wars linked in here? So I just made up some extra slides here towards the end, just to make sure that I could get it back in there. But there's more to it than me just trying to throw Star Wars back at you and spending way too much time trying to make dynamic slides. Because I think you are in a unique moment here in South Australia. It's easy for me to say as an outsider, but at the same time, it's an informed thing for me to say as an outsider, that there is a wonderful opportunity here and hope for what you're able to achieve. You have an opportunity to engage with broadening what it is we come to think of as educating children and youth in your schools. And that's all the way from early childhood through into post-secondary. But there isn't this opportunity to engage in something substantive, to make a difference for the children and youth that you have in your school, to be able to come up with a more comprehensive way of building a profile of what it means to be educated in South Australian secondary schools. I think that's an opportunity that is rare. At least, in my almost 50 years, I'm unaware of it. Someone will probably destroy that story later on, but I'm going to stick with it for the moment. It's a rare opportunity to engage with this. The excitement, the fact that you have more people here than what you have had in any past conference speaks to this volume and this energy that you have going on here. In all of my visits to come and work with you and do the pre-work, like all of these types of things, there is an energy related to this opportunity. So for me, I'm actually filled with a lot of hope about what is currently happening in South Australia, what is about to happen in South Australia, and arguably the intergenerational effect that may have on educators, on schools, on communities, and most importantly, on the students that you have in front of you now and the students that you have in front of you in the years ahead. I live in hope that you get to take advantage of this opportunity. I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to speak to you both last year and then again this year. I hope that it has given you some stimulus to think around how context does matter for you, what context looks like in your own school, what context looks like across your entire system, and then how you can work consistently with the high quality educators that you have to deliver equitable excellence across South Australian schools. So thank you very much for that, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.